I'm going to get us started here, and then I'm going to jump on and maybe try and re-email some of our people with that direction, if that's okay. For those of you that are on here so far, we welcome you to our discussion forum of the film Honeyland. This is a free series that is brought to you by Hope College's Green Team, the Macatawa Creation Care, League of Women Voters-Holland Area, and the Citizens Climate Lobby. We've been putting on this film series for a number of years now. We've been able to do it in person for a while and then over in Graves Hall, but due to COVID restrictions, this is the safest option for us to be able to carry this film series forward. So with that, I'm going to do a quick intro bio or introduction to Peter Bogart, who's going to be our moderator for tonight. Peter, if you can give just a little wave. So Peter is retired and living in Zeeland, Michigan. He spent the last 10 years of his career at the Ottawa County and City of Holland working in residential energy efficiency programs. Peter is the leader of a local creation care ministries and has a keen interest in the intersection of values and policy. He's an active member of the Holland Area Citizens Climate Lobby chapter, and Peter also works with the Holland Climate Collaborative in their efforts to encourage the City of Holland to establish an aggressive carbon reduction goal. So with that, again, we welcome you to tonight's event, and I'm going to put my screen on mute for a second so I can type to a few other people, but with that, I'll turn it over to Peter to introduce each of our panelists and get us started. Thank you. You're still on mute, Peter.
I think there's a market for someone to make a t-shirt that says unmute yourself. That's somehow that's going to be, if there's ever a time capsule from our area, that's a phrase that will be captured and retained. Good evening, everyone. We're glad you're here. Thank you for participating with us in this. I'd like first to introduce Julie Ornay. Julie is the Survey and Research Manager at Frost Center for Data and Research. She spent time in Macedonia as a Peace Corps volunteer from 2006 to 2008. Her efforts there included community development and youth activities. And Julie, just a quick question to get started. Would you share with us just your impression, having seen the film? What's your thoughts, your main takeaway?
Yeah, so I first saw the film probably towards March of last year, and then again rewatched it today, and I just loved it. I felt like it was very emotional for me, having been in Macedonia and seeing, and not that my experience was exactly like that, but I just felt like even just the mannerisms of people just brought back so many memories to me. So I just felt like it was like such a treat and a treasure to have something. It was almost like having my experience all of a sudden like available that I could show people and be like, see, this is kind of like, this is the landscape, this is what people sometimes were like, and like, you know, and so I just felt like that was such a gift to me to be able to like watch that with my husband and explain what that was like. So there was a text going around with some of my previous Peace Corps volunteer friends that just said like, it wasn't a funny film, but we just like couldn't stop laughing about some of it too, just because it was just like such a kindred like kind of connection that we had with each other too. So so I really loved the film. I thought it was a very beautiful film. It kind of showed some of the racial tensions. I think it showed some of the history of Macedonia and some of the beauty of its landscape as well as some of the things going forward that that kind of the communities are struggling with, just kind of matching some of the old ways of doing things and then some of the kind of more or less new, maybe not as sustainable ways of doing things in some extent, but then also kind of coming along with awareness of sustainability practices and whatnot. So yeah, I thought the film was great. I did a lot of research about it right after I watched it the first time, just to kind of figure out where the community was that they filmed and whatnot too. So So I thought it was great. And it just kind of, I think you can kind of take it to any context too. You can take it to the States and see, yeah, there's things like that we can struggle with. And I don't think there's, it's not necessarily like that the family in that film is a bad family. It's just, you can see where they're coming from as well. So I thought it was really well done.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Joining us as a panelist also tonight is Kim Wood, who has been a West Michigan educator for more than 35 years. She's an active urban beekeeper in the city of North Muskegon. And her apiary includes 15 to 20 colonies, depending on time of year. She serves as the Education Outreach Coordinator for Muskegon Area Beekeepers and is a member of the Holland Area Beekeeping Association and Fremont Area Beekeepers. Kim's message is simple. You do not have to be a beekeeper to have a positive impact on pollinators. As a master gardener, Kim combines her lifelong love of teaching with her passion for people, plants, and pollinators. So Kim, just an opening question for you also. Do you have an initial impression from the film that you'd like to share?
Sure. And like Julie, I saw it when it was initially released. And so today I rewatched it. And my body just responds viscerally to the story. And like Julie, I researched it after I watched it. I just let it happen to me. Then I did research, and I wanted to know what happened to her, and all the stories. And it turns out that it's traditional in Macedonia that the last daughter does not marry, and often her life is dedicated to the care of her parents until their death. So there were just a lot of powerful cultural things there that just really caught my breath. If I look at it from the beekeeping side of the story, it's interesting that she keeps her bees in the traditional ancient skep method with cow dung and the things that have gone on for generations with beekeepers. But yet when the Turkish family comes in, they get the wooden boxes and the frames, and they do the traditional Langstroth hive, which is what most people do with beekeeping in most of the modern world. And you can see where it's going, when she says we leave half for the bees, because it's really, really true. Somebody said, how much honey do you get? And if your first question about bees is how much honey do you get, you might not be a beekeeper. because some years you don't get honey. If there's rain, if there's dearth, if there's cold, if there's a bad spring, there are all these reasons why the bees don't always have extra. And if you're a beekeeper, your first responsibility is to care for those bees that you're asking to live in this box and basically become your livestock. You're responsible for their care. And so whether you get honey is the last question in a beekeeper's calendar, the very last question. And she understood that so well at a very spiritual level. And I thought the cinematography showing her connection to the land and to the bees and to everything around her was just profound. You don't have to be a beekeeping person to be moved by all of that.
Okay, thank you. Also joining us as a panelist tonight is Steve Bauma-Prediger, who is the Leonard and Marjorie Moss Professor of Reformed Theology at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. A graduate of Hope College, his PhD is in Religious Studies from the University of Chicago. His most recent book is Earthkeeping and Character, Exploring a Christian Ecological Virtue Ethic. In 1999, he was the recipient of the Hope Outstanding Professor Educator Award. And just to bring him back down to earth, every Sunday afternoon, he goes hiking with his dog, Lily. Steve, an initial impression from the film.
Well, I would echo what my co-panelists, Julie and Kim, have said. Especially, I was struck, and I finished watching it this morning for the first time. I was struck by the cinematography and just the beauty of the landscape. combined with the poverty and the harshness of making a living. And I just found the film to be captivating. I not knowing how the plot lines would work themselves out. I kept thinking about all those references in the Torah and the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, about land of milk and honey. And here we have this woman. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name. Hatidza, I guess it's Macedonian, I presume. But just her love and care for these bees, and her, she's just sort of part of the landscape in a really healthy way. And then this family comes in and, well, to put it mildly, just complicates things. I mean, it disrupts her life in many ways, including her losing bees. And just again, the contrast, as Kim was saying, between sort of two different methods or ways of keeping bees. So I was very struck by lots of features of the film, not just the quality of it, but the plot, the character development, and my sense of learning something about a part of the world that has had an extremely troubled past for hundreds of years that I know virtually nothing about. What my generation call the former Yugoslavia. So this was eye-opening in many ways for me. And I should also say too, Macedonia, again, biblically, we have references to Macedonia. St. Paul was there. He writes about it, or Luke does, about Paul in the book of Acts. And of course, we have First Thessalonians. Thessalonica is in former Macedonia, northern Greece. So they're interesting connections to the Bible in the film as well.
Like many of you, I watched the film for the first time this afternoon, and I was trying to monitor my own thoughts and feelings as I watched. And I found that it was a compelling, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. And I'm wondering if you folks have insight into, I hear you all saying, boy, I was gripped by this film. Do you have some insights for me on what's the connection from those of us in urban, suburban North America and this woman from Macedonia?
Well, I think they did an excellent job, the filmmakers, because they did 400 hours of filming over 3 years to bring us this masterpiece. And more than 3 or 4 times in the film, we were into the poverty, the stone, the rock, the desert, the bleakness of everything. And then they would show a modern jet flying in the landscape. And one of the characters looking up and looking over at the jet. So reminding us that we're not in biblical times. We're not in Thessalonia. We're right here in now. And this is now, not then.
Yeah.
Julie, I wonder if you could pick up that question, because of us all, you're the one in the best position to kind of juxtapose these two cultures. Why was this so compelling?
Yeah, I think it was a successful juxtaposition in that you see kind of this ancient way of doing things. I mean, these Turkish villages have been living there probably since the Ottoman Empire, and then many of which of the Turkish residents moved out after World War II. But they had this way of doing things. I visited a few villages similar to this, with no running water, the only way to heat something would be a wood stove, which was actually pretty typical in most Macedonian homes. But no electricity, and just kind of holding on to this way of life that they knew, with the expectation, there weren't any youth in these villages typically, with the expectation that the village would probably die at some point. And so we have that, and that was actually a little bit stigmatized by the Macedonian culture, of like, oh, we're not gonna live up there like that. You know, like we're going
Mhm.
to university, we're gonna join the EU, we're gonna do these types of things. And I think I'm having a hard time characterizing the mainstream Macedonian culture because I did see lots of issues with sustainability, but at the same point, there was a little bit more awareness, I think, too, of like some of these, of kind of, if you are not being sustainable, what the repercussions will be eventually too.
Mhm.
So I think that was coming along, but one of the first things I saw when I went into the country was we took this trip from Skopje, which is the capital, to Veles, which is one of the main cities, which is actually very close to where this was filmed. And we took this bus trip and we just saw this huge hillside full of garbage. And it was just like, it was awestruck. I was very awestruck of like, what is going on, you know? And I think it's just because there isn't necessarily the planned government kind of oversight of like, this is what we do with our garbage type of thing, you know. Like I think it's just very piecemeal type of like, maybe every city does a little bit something different, and the cities that can afford to do something, but some of them don't. And so I think there's some more awareness of like the repercussions of like not taking care of your garbage or not doing things like that, but at the same point I think that's kind of coming along slowly too. And so so I think that there's this culture kind of in the mountainsides that waste nothing, you know, but then there's also the culture of kind of more of the developing cities that, you know, they are going through that time of, we don't really know what to do with our garbage, so we throw it out the window, or, you know, and that's certainly not the Macedonian culture as a whole. So I don't want to like I don't want you to think that it is, but there are certainly sections that do that, probably because they might feel like there's not any other options, or they don't really know what to do with it. So yeah, that was a long-winded answer, sorry.
Steve, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah. I was just struck by the relationships. I mean, think about, again, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name, had to see in her mother, her 85-year-old mom who's been 4 years in bed, and those scenes with the candles in the background, and it's dark and it's clear mom's not doing well. And they have this banter back and forth. It's kind of funny and fun, but serious. And you get this intimacy of the relationship. And even before we found out the brief question about the matchmaker, you know, you're sort of wondering, she's born in 1964, that, you know, so she's in her 50s. Why didn't she marry? Now we have some reason to believe an explanation for that. But those relationships between mother, daughter, and then of course when the Turkish family shows up with the camper with 7 kids, I think I counted, you know, the relationship that they had and that developed. And again, one of the kids takes a shine to Hatchetsy and she to him, but then there's lots of animosity eventually between her and this new family. So it was just, and then the resilience that the main character had amidst the poverty, the oppression from the neighbors, the loss in the very end of her mother when she died. Her mom, you know, cursed be the neighbors, and then they've killed all my bees. And mom says, may God burn their livers. I mean, there's was that a translation of some aphorism, I suppose, in Macedonian that, you know, we're blind to because we don't speak that language. So there's again a kind of mix of humor with this poignant portrayal of this resilient woman and what's left of her life and culture. So that's what, for me, was really quite moving and touching about the whole film.
And what I would add on to that, Steve, is through all of this hardship, she was stoic and cheerful and saw good in things and saw good in people and wanted to help and was charming when she was at the market, you know, with her honey.
Right.
Very social, but yet she didn't complain until they over harvested their honey, stressed their bees out. And then bees do this. Honeybees will rob a weaker colony. So when they killed her bees, that was the first moment in the film where you heard a harsh word out of her.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
Kim, could you just say a moment, fill us in a little bit more on beekeeping, which, you know, my experience with honey is that it comes in a little plastic bear-shaped jar at the grocery
Okay.
store.
Okay.
And yet here appeared to be really two different ways of being a beekeeper. And I don't know if one is more legitimate than the other, or is that just cultural adaptation? Would you
Well,
say?
we like to say that all beekeeping is local. So when I talk to people about beekeeping, I talk about the reality of beekeeping here in West Michigan. I mean, right now I have to go out every day, even though my hives are elevated a couple feet off the ground. I have to go out every day and brush snow off the landing boards right now because that's how deep our snow is. But in Mississippi, they have different issues. And, you know, it's so beekeeping is local. And so what I tell people about beekeeping is if you get into it because you're interested in bees or pollinators, want to learn things, you know, if you're really into it for the bees, then that's one type of beekeeper. But if you're a commercial beekeeper, like the kinds that have hundreds of beehives that go on flatbed trucks right now in February, they're pollinating almonds.
Mhm.
And it's a huge money industry. These people make hundreds of thousands of dollars in 4 to 6 weeks. But those bees live a very harsh life, and they often get lost from their colonies. Once they leave, they're hauled to maybe an apple orchard in another state. And it's a tough life, you know, like being a migrant worker. Migrant bees live a tough life moving across America. And that's a different kind of beekeeper. So when I talk about beekeeping, I'm really talking to the hobbyist or the backyard person. And it's a very spiritual thing, like she said. There are times when I just sit in a chair in my bee yard and just watch the bees, just watch them come and go on the landing boards. And you get messages from them. So, you know, when you saw the children being stung and everybody being stung, well, of course, it would be like if somebody came to your house and ripped the roof off and started, you know, pulling things out of your house, you'd be a little defensive too. But if you pay attention to the bees and their rhythms and their times, you'll know when it's time to open up the hive. You'll know when it's not a good time. I try to open my hives in the middle of the day, like between 11 and 1 if I can choose, because that's when most of the field bees are out doing their jobs and there are just fewer bees to annoy. So just little small things about being in tune with them. That's one of the joys of beekeeping. And clearly Hatcha loved her bees. You know, they were essential to her being.
Mhm.
And many times she didn't need smoke and she didn't need a veil because she knew it was a good time.
We've had a comment from one of our listeners to the effect that the document about the filmmaking itself tells us that it was all filmed in Turkish, but the filmmakers did not speak Turkish. And they made a decision to do all their editing without knowing any of the language translation. Only after the editing and the creation of the film did they find that the editing matched the language. And it's just, I don't know if you need to comment on that, but there's something about knowing and understanding people that isn't necessarily confined by language that I'm seeing in that. And I'm wondering if maybe that wasn't part of the great appeal of the film for me. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that at all, but
Yeah, so Hatsid and her mother spoke Turkish. They were of Turkish descent as well as the family that moved in, so that's why they could communicate. The filmmakers were ethnic Macedonians, and so they didn't speak Turkish, which is typically the way it goes. Turkish folks typically speak Macedonian, but Macedonian folks don't typically speak Turkish. And so the only part that I understood, because I spoke Macedonian when I was there, was the time in the market when she was there. And so when she was bartering with only one of the men, actually, could I understand the language. So.
Okay. The only parallel for me was traveling in Nicaragua and El Salvador 30 years ago. And I do not speak Spanish. But there comes a point in time when you start to absorb the rhythm and cadence of the world and you begin to think you know Spanish. And at that point, you start to link to people, whether you exactly know the language or not. I sense some of that happening in this film. Let me change directions just a little bit, because there's a theme that some of you have begun to articulate. And to let you know, we were challenged somewhat as a film series when we selected this film. You know, our purpose is to help educate people about environmental issues, sustainability issues, and try and give them the background and knowledge they need to make good decisions. And the challenge to us was, well, this isn't an environmental film. Although I thought I heard you folks beginning to say, you know, I was seeing issues in there that speak to me about sustainability, that speak to me about environmental integrity. I wonder, Kim, could you pick up on that thought at all? What were you seeing this was not, you know, a Chamber of Commerce travelogue?
Right.
What were
right.
you seeing that tells you otherwise?
Well, one of the things was actually the cattle. You know, they came with a certain number of cattle and they created makeshift pens for them and they appeared to be feeding them. But towards the end of the film, they had 50 calves die. Just like the pressure that the Turkish father was feeling from this guy who wanted more and more kilos. He wanted 200 kilos of honey. And the guy knew that this would be bad for the bees. And he kept saying, there is no more honey and there is no more honey. And so the economic pressures they have of trying to earn money to sustain a family of 7 cause them to make bad decisions that in the end cause the demise of their bees and their cattle, their complete livelihood. Because they weren't able to maintain sustainable practices. And rather than figure out what they did, they just picked up and moved somewhere else, you know, where maybe there are new resources. There is no disease in the water for the cattle. There are more bees, but you could see the economic pressure on the family that caused them to make unsustainable choices that even some of them they knew better and did them anyway.
Okay. Julie, I thought I heard you hinting at some sustainability observations earlier. Could you pick up that thought?
Yeah, certainly. Kind of even going along with what Kim was just saying, just to give you a little bit more kind of like cultural context. Typically Turkish people within the Macedonian society are kind of like low on the totem pole. And typically it's systematic. And so Turkish kids get sat in the back of the classrooms, and Turkish kids don't get the same resources as Macedonian kids do. And it's all over the place, healthcare, everything. And so Turkish and Roma people, which are typically like what you and I would think of as, you know, it's not a great term, but like gypsy people, are typically put together. They speak the same language. And that's kind of, they're typically don't nearly have the amount of, healthcare is probably non-existent, honestly, for them. Education levels are very low. Unemployment is huge. Typically, the main employment is playing in a band for like weddings and different celebrations and stuff. They're very musical, but so so I can see also the economic pressure, which causes them to make decisions that they know aren't necessarily the best, but at the same point, you know, I think that's kind of what they have to do. And it's like this terrible self-fulfilling prophecy too of, oh, then they get this Turkish family in there and they do this and you know, and so I think, you know, it just kind of like keeps going. And so, but it's because of that kind of systematic racism, I guess, that, you know, that exists in the Macedonian society typically. So, so just to kind of give you an idea as to, this family wouldn't necessarily be welcomed in the town that I lived in. They would be living on the outskirts. So, so I think that that's probably some of the reason why they had to make these, you know, potentially poor decisions to keep food on the table.
You're reminding me that environmental justice is a rising concern in climate change discussions here, because the question is, who ends up living next to an oil refinery? It's the people who can't afford not to live there.
Yeah, where's the
Okay.
landfill, right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Okay. Steve, did you want to say anything about you may be seeing sustainability issues?
Well, no, just to reiterate briefly what Kim said, it was very clear that the economic pressure being put on the family was forcing them to make some foolish environmental decisions. And, you know, there are lots of other examples of that all over the world, whether you're in Central America or parts of the US or here in Macedonia. So again, I guess it depends on what, you know, how you define environmental. And we tend to define that, I think, too narrowly along traditional lines, when in fact, environmental, if we're talking ecological, it's all about the oikos, the house. We're all connected. You know, there are lots of other issues, environmental justice being one of them, that are environmental issues by their very nature, but often they're not considered truly environmental because we have a more narrow understanding or definition of what counts as environmental. So I think we need to expand our understanding of what counts as environmental, and there are lots of issues here in this film, I think, that are brought out quite clearly.
Thank you. Kim, could you share with us, was there one particular scene in the film which you continue to see it or kind of arrested your attention?
Yeah, it was moments with her and her mother. I mean, it was that intimacy between her and her mother, and we were like flies on the wall. You know, it was a darkened space lit by candlelight or barely lit, and her mother had been bedridden. And I'm thinking, what do they talk about for 4 years?
Mm,
What do they talk about for 4 years? And you know, just when she tries to get the antenna going to get a little music on the radio just before her mom passes, Mom, can you hear the music? Mom, can you hear the music? And I'm just thinking, what did they fill those hours with?
Hmm.
And that just has stayed in my mind. We're so overstimulated, and I just couldn't imagine how many hours they must have spent sharing him.
yeah. Julie, was there a moment in the film for you that arrested your attention?
I would say I really enjoyed the time with her mother too, and kind of the banter that they had. I also feel like probably a more visceral moment was them dragging the dead calves away. It just made me sick to my stomach. And so I think the first time I watched that, I literally just started crying because I was like, oh, this is just so terrible. And so, yeah, so that one just really affected me. But yeah.
Okay. Steve, any particularly memorable moment for you?
Both of the ones just mentioned, actually, the calves being pulled away at the death of the mother, and at the end, that line I think I mentioned already, where Atidza says, "They've killed all my bees,"
Yeah.
and there's just this you know, that combined with the tears in her eyes and the lighting again, it was just, yeah, I was in tears with her. And just this sense that what's given her so much meaning in her life is gone through no fault of her own. So that was a powerful image time.
Okay. Well, sure. There were two images for me, and you may want to respond, that I saw kind of in tandem. One was the guys with the chainsaw who went after the last colony of wild bees.
Yeah.
They had destroyed every bee colony in sight, and then they went after the last one they could find.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something about the difficulty of humans to learn environmental lessons. At what point do you catch on? And it was, to me, it was that expression we have in North America, they're going to shoot the last buffalo.
Mm.
It was an enormous resource beyond comprehension. And we shot them until we killed the last one, almost.
Or the lorax in the trees. I mean, how many years ago did we have the lorax in the trees? Have we learned our lesson?
Yeah. The other image which I saw in parallel with that was burning the juniper trees.
Mm.
Because we wanted to remanage the natural environment in order to produce bees. And we wanted to preference bees because bees would give us honey. And there wasn't a recognition that there was an integrated environment here that probably needed those juniper trees to function well.
Mm.
And again, the image for me from North America was all of those desperately poor immigrants who poured into the interior of the country and plowed it up until it was a dust bowl.
Mm.
And there's just something about us as human beings that is hard to come to terms with. To me, that was where I was seeing my own country when I saw those two images. Greed beyond belief, that you would cut down the tree to get the last colony. Who isn't thinking, after I destroy this resource, now how I'm going to make a living?
I'm just going to go somewhere else. I'm just going to pick up and hook everything together and try my luck somewhere else. That's what they did.
But that says to me that's our difficulty in North America, because that's been our MO. Climate change is telling us we finally hit the wall. And I'm thinking, so in terms of cinematography, I really took note of the fact that the opening scenes and the ending scenes were bookends. The same mountain cliff, the same mountain beehive, the same lone woman, and then kind of this rather contented sitting on the mountain just to be there. And I'm going to ask you initially, Steve, to pick up some thought there, because I thought that was rather poignant. And I thought it was also, if cinematographers are ever obvious, that was for you to catch.
Yeah.
That was, where is real happiness? Where is wisdom? Where is contentment?
Yeah.
What does it mean to live a good life?
Yeah.
And there was something about her being on the land and part of the land that speaks to that question about, how can I be happy? So I wonder, can you pick up on that theme at all?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned that. That struck me too with the bookends there. And the first time early on, I thought, my goodness, this woman needs climbing gear. I mean, she's going to fall off this cliff. And then not knowing that why she was going there until, it's revealed that there are bees there naturally. And then at the very end too, again, I had a sense it's sort of a refugia. It was a refuge place, not just for the bees, but for her. And that given at the end of the film, all the bad things, frankly, that had happened to her, this was again kind of a refuge for her and the bees just to be. together, and with beautiful scenery and this sense that, yeah, the greedy folks can even go after the bee on the tree that's over the river. But this is a place that's sort of secret and hidden away, even though it's on a mountain, and where she and the bees can just be together. And again, a kind of a refuge. And it ended and began that way. So despite the terrible things that happened to her, there's this glimmer of hope there, I think, at the end.
Mhm. Kim, do you have any thoughts? What kind of woman were we looking at the end of the film?
Well, we were looking at a contented woman. I mean, she really looked at peace. And I hope my mother isn't on this website, but I help care for my 85-year-old mother. And she lives on her own. But today I had to help her because she was getting her eyes dilated. And tomorrow I'm taking her to get her COVID, her first vaccine. And she has another appointment on Thursday. And so I'm caring for my mother right now, not obviously in the same way she is, but I have siblings who don't participate in the care of my mother, and they haven't for several years since my father passed. So I'm sharing something very personal. But even on my most challenging day, I will never have any regrets. And so I don't think she has any regrets. I think she is content. She is satisfied with what her life has been, and she knows it's not over because she knows she will recreate those bees and she will have honey again because she'll endure.
Mhm. And in fact, the stock of bees was not exhausted. She knew where to find them.
Right.
Exactly. Exactly.
Julie, do you have anything to add to that thought?
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to what Kim was saying, I think that culture really just knows how to enjoy. You know, they sit down for cups of coffee with each other for hours on end, you know, and I think they just, that's what some, you know, that's one thing that they would always say, uji vai, you know, and that's like enjoy. So I think that's what struck me going there, and that's what struck me coming back, was just the pace difference. And you know, like my day could be filled with having a couple hours of coffee and maybe cooking a meal with somebody, and then maybe going to the store to pick up a few things for some, you know, like, and so it was just a so much slower culture that people just had the opportunity to kind of enjoy nature. A lot of people went for hikes, and really enjoyed like the local river that we had a lot of like campouts and barbecues and stuff too. So I think, you know, people really do appreciate the natural environment that's there. And I think Hadizad is similar to that there, where she has that sense of contentedness, and that sense of taking care of something still. I think that was something that, you know, she continued doing. Even though she was done taking care of her mother, she still could take care of those bees. So yeah.
Mhm. One of the biblical themes that I've learned coming out of the story of manna in the wilderness, another barren place to live, was that we need to learn the difference between enough and too much. The people in the wilderness who took too much found that their manna rotted in their jars overnight. The people who knew how to live with, they knew where to draw the line. How much is enough? Was kind of a critical learning. And one of my real takeaways from this film is the reemergence of that theme juxtaposed with my life in North America. Because I'm not in a place that knows where to draw the line. Consequently, nobody's happy. It's because there's never enough. And I think to be presented this woman's life, which some people would describe as simple, others would describe as primitive, struck me as emotionally and spiritually mature. And there's something blessed in knowing that there are people like that, and that's not a dream. That can be real. So we are nearing the end of our time. And Kim, I have got to ask you,
Okay.
because I got my mailing from the Natural Resources Defense Council, and they are all
Yeah.
over the bee story.
Yes.
Colony collapse, chemical contamination. How optimistic are you on behalf of bees these days?
Well, you're gonna have to get the whole thing then. You're gonna get more than the elevator speech. One, pollinators are more than bees. Pollinators are birds, butterflies, moths, wasps, hummingbirds, all kind. Bats pollinate things at night like moonflowers.
Mhm.
So I don't just limit my thoughts to bees. I think of pollinators in general. And some of what's happened with our pollinators is this need to mow down everything in the median and mow down everything alongside the road. We're in this lawn, like a sculpted lawn. When I was a kid, we had clover in our lawn.
Mhm.
Now everybody wants it to look manicured like the third green at the country club. So there's a lot of stuff we are doing for these manicured lawns and green spaces where we are harming all the pollinators. The second problem with pollinators are these large ag farms. Because, I drove across part of Canada with my dad several years ago, and I think we went 4 hours before we were without canola. There were yellow canola blossoms for 4 hours on both sides of the road forever. And when you have monocrops like that in large sections, then the pollinators have access when that particular crop is blooming. And then when the miles and miles and miles of canola or corn or whatever it is done, then the pollinators have nothing. There's a dearth the rest of the time. So we don't do a good job of offering plenty. And then the third thing is, and I say you don't have to be a beekeeper to help pollinators. Honeybees are not native to North America. And you can come to my presentation that I do at libraries and schools that talks about how the European immigrants weren't sure what they were going to find here. So they brought fruit trees and they brought their stuff from home that they knew, and they brought skeps of bees over on those boats. You never know it. And how honeybees got across the continental United States was the whole migration west. They came in covered wagons, but because the wagons are covered, you never see their bee skeps. So how we have wild bees or feral honeybees is simply ones that got away, So as much as honeybees are an important pollinator for us, they're not native. And so there's a whole school of thought that says we have to prevent honeybees from being successful in certain areas because they're pushing out native pollinators. We have over 250 kind of bees just in Michigan. We have 13 different species of bumblebee in Michigan. And last year, the Michigan State University apiary program couldn't find 3 of them anywhere in Michigan, and they know where to look. So it's a bigger picture than just colony collapse disorder or things like that with the bees. We've got a whole ecosystem that we're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Is that good enough?
That was more than I thought was there.
Okay.
Steve, I wonder, as a last comment, if you would share some thoughts about place and personhood. I know that some of your writing, you have reflected on the fact that if you don't know your place, you can't really have a home. You can't ever really feel at home. And it just struck me that not only was this woman, she was the land. Without that place, she doesn't have an identity.
Right.
And we tend to, because I've worked in construction a lot, and I know the figures, people tend to move every 7 years.
Mhm.
Is it even possible for us to be full people without establishing a sense of place?
Yeah, that's a great question, Peter. Before I answer it, let me just show you a book on the theme that Kim was just talking about. I was looking for A Columbian Exchange by Alfred Crosby. I don't know where it is. I must have lent it to a student, but here's one of his follow-up books, Ecological Imperialism, The Biological Expansion of Europe, 900 to 1900. And he lays out in considerable detail exactly what Kim was just talking about, the exchange of not just of what we consider market goods, but of plants, insects from one continent to another, starting in 1492, but going on for quite a long time. You're exactly right. And what comes to mind is the work of Wendell Berry in particular on both these issues, actually, especially on place and the need for us to know our place. And as you said very clearly, the main character in Honeyland, you said it well, is her place, and her place is her. It's hard to imagine her any flourishing anywhere else. But we've become a culture here in North America, especially, as you say, of people moving, mobile people, and people who are homeless in our own homeland. We feel homeless. You mentioned, I've done some work on this. This is one of the books, probably hard to see, Beyond Homelessness, Christian Faith in a Culture of Displacement. But my colleague Brian Welsh and I spend a couple chapters talking about what we call ecological homelessness, of people not feeling at home on our home planet, and people not feeling at home, even if they have a fancy house, not feeling at home in that place. We have actually a category of the well-housed homeless, people who have, $1 million homes, but still houses, but still feel homeless, because homelessness comes in many different forms. So the bottom line is, we need to know our place, and we need to know the flora, the fauna, the other people who live in our place if we're going to be able to take care of it properly. We can only care of a place well if we know it. And we're not going to even want to care about it unless we love it. And we only love it if we know it. So there's a lot of work to be done by those of us who are educators, especially to help our students come to know their places, become more ecologically literate about where they grow up, where they live. Do they know where their water comes from, where their garbage goes? Can they identify any birds, trees, bees that live in their area? So I could talk a lot more about that, but you raise a very good question that all of us need to address.
Okay, thank you. We are reaching the end of our time here. And this just been such a rich discussion. So Kim and Steve and Julie, thank you so much. I don't know that we could have understood the film as well as we do without the background you've helped us with here this evening. So thank you so much for your contributions to this discussion. And I believe we've got a slide to put up, letting you know what the next film in the series is. Yeah, February 23, Kiss the Ground.
Mm-hmm.
Invite you all to sign up to be a part of that. You can be able to view it again as this one was at your own time on the given day, and then another panel discussion that evening. So on behalf of all the partners here, the Hope College Green Team, Macatawa Creation Care, League of Women Voters-Holland Area, and the Citizens Climate Lobby-Holland Area, we want to thank you all for being part of this and for spending time with us tonight. I hope it helped you understand bees better. I hope it helped you understand environment better. And again, thank you all so much.
Thank you.